Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herbert W. This is the first video of a 6-part series on the Apostle Paul, his life, his ministry, and his letters. There is available a booklet entitled The Apostle Paul, available for purchase to follow along with this series of videos on the Apostle Paul. It can be found on Amazon. Now, one of the things that we do throughout this series is we read a lot of Scripture. Part of the desire and mission of the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies is to encourage the reading, studying, teaching, and preaching of the Bible. So throughout the notes, we have the readings mostly from Acts, because that's where we read the most about Paul. We are reading from the Net Bible, the New English Translation. And the person who is reading Scripture for us is Dr. Skip Forbes, former professor at Grace College and Seminary. So let me pause by inviting you to perhaps visit Amazon and pick up the booklet, but you don't need the booklet to enjoy and benefit from this series of lectures on Paul, his life, his ministry, and his letters. We're going to begin this lesson on the Apostle Paul, focusing on his self-portrait, looking at both his personal information and his professional information. To give an overview of what it is that we're going to be looking at during this session, we can summarize Paul's self-portrait in the following manner. Paul was a Jew who grew up in an affluent religious home, who was raised in the Jewish tradition of his parents, who had a dual citizenship, who was educated in a renowned religious school, who became a teacher of religion, who joined a group of like-minded Jews, and who exhibited a great deal of zeal against those who followed Jesus. First, we want to look at Paul's personal information. Paul tells us that he was born a citizen of Tarsus. We read about this in Acts 21, verse 39.
I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city.
First thing we need to ask yourself as we look at this verse, where is Tarsus? This verse has several items in it that warrant a little investigation. So first, where is Tarsus? Well, Tarsus was part of the Roman Empire, the capital city of the Roman province of Cilicia, and located just west of the Roman province of Galatia. The city was situated in a valley of the eastern Cilicia on the river of Cnidus that emptied into the Mediterranean Sea, and a rather important port city. As we look at a map that is a broad overview of geography relevant for Paul of Tarsus, we see where Tarsus is located, just west of Antioch, and you can see where Tarsus is located in the geographical region of Galatia. If we were to look at Tarsus in a modern-day map of Turkey, you can see where Tarsus is located here on a map. So how important was Tarsus? Tarsus was a prosperous city. It was a large city with a population of about 1 million people living in an area that was 8 to 10 square miles. As a port city located on the eastern Cilicia on the river Cnidus, Tarsus had a bustling commerce. It was known for its timber, its leather goods, and its silicium cloth, unique to the area for making tents. And this is rather important when we stop to think about the fact that Paul was a tent maker. Next, we realize And we come to understand that Tarsus is a city that is rich in history. Rich in history. For centuries, Tarsus was always considered a city with a significant political standing among the cities of Asia Minor. Alexander the Great passed through Tarsus as he was conquering the Persian. This painting of Alexander in this river reflects and is an illustration of a time when Alexander went swimming in the Cilicia River and he caught himself pneumonia and nearly died. Eventually, Tarsus would come underneath Seleucid control, and granted self-governing city-state status. So Tarsus became a Greek city-state. When Tarsus came under Roman rule by way of Pompey, Pompey made Tarsus the capital over the Roman province of Cilicia. And Jews began to receive Roman citizenship. Mark Antony declared the city free in 42 BC. Tarsus continued to receive special privileges under Augustus, who exempted the city from imperial taxation. The other thing that we learn about Tarsus is that Tarsus was a university city. A university city. Strabo, a Greek author who wrote about geographical cities throughout the Greek Empire, he wrote that the people of Tarsus were avid in the pursuit of culture. They applied themselves to the study of philosophy, the liberal arts, and the whole round of learning in general. It was a city that had a liberal education, which is also important when you stop and think about Paul and his ministry, particularly when he goes to Greece and he dialogues with the philosophers on Mars Hills. So what's so significant about Paul's citizenship that he promotes and boasts of in this verse in Acts? Well, Paul came from an affluent and influential city. In antiquity, only privileged families of standing were granted citizenship of Tarsus. They were responsible for its government and would assemble to conduct the affairs of the city that affected corporate life in the city. And the way that a person was distinguished within the city of being of affluent background was the manner in which they dressed. A person of affluency would dress one way, whereas a slave would dress another. So in summary, when Paul tells us that he's born a citizen of Tarsus, Paul tells us that he was raised in an affluent family who had significant standing in the rather important city of Tarsus. The next thing we want to examine concerning Paul in his life is that he was born a Hellenistic Jew. A Hellenistic Jew. Paul was one of many diaspora Jews who lived throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. As a Greek-speaking citizen of Tarsus, educated in Jerusalem, he was a Hellenistic Jew. And we read about this in Acts 21:39 and chapter 22, verse 3.
I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen in an important city. And I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, that is Jerusalem.
Now, before we begin, I think it would be helpful to talk about what is a diaspora. What do we mean when we talk about Paul was a Jew that was part of the diaspora? Well, diaspora is simply a word that means a scattered population. So the Jews were a group of people that had been scattered throughout the Roman world. That scattering actually began long ago when Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 and then again by the Babylonians in 586. They were scattered to the Assyrian and the Babylonian Empire. But that scattering continued to exist for the Jews, and there are several places and cities throughout the Roman Empire that reflect this Jewish scattering. And the Jews that lived in these scattered cities throughout the Roman Empire were referred to and recognized as being Hellenistic Jews. So Paul was one of many diaspora Jews who lived throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. And as you look at this map, you can see these red dots that reflect this diaspora, the scattering of Jews throughout the Roman Empire in different cities. As a Jew, as a Greek-speaking citizen of Tarsus, educated in Jerusalem, he was considered a Hellenistic Jew, not to be confused with someone who was born and raised in Jerusalem. Paul also tells us that he was a descendant of Abraham. And we read about this in Romans chapter 11, verse 1.
So I ask, God has not rejected his people, has he? Absolutely not. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin.
And if we were to look at a family tree of Abraham, we can see that Abraham married Sarah. Sarah and Abraham have Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac have Jacob. And from Jacob, we have the fact that Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, one of the sons of Jacob. Paul tells us that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. We read about this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5.
I was circumcised on the 8th day from the people of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I lived according to the law as a Pharisee.
Now, when we look at this chart, this family tree of Jacob's sons, which we could read about in Genesis 49, you can see that through his one wife, Leah, he has several sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, and Issachar. Through his second wife, his favored wife, there are the sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. Paul is telling us that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. So when we talk about Paul as being a Hellenistic Jew, we might summarize this personal information about him in this manner. Paul tells us that he was a diaspora Jew who recognized Abraham as his patriarch, and that his lineage stemmed from the tribe of Benjamin. The next important piece of information to know about Paul is the fact that he is born a citizen of Rome. A citizen of Rome. What did it mean to be born a citizen of Rome? Roman citizenship, according to Roman law, is found in the Lex Valeria and the Lex Porcia, where ancient Roman laws prohibiting the beating and even the chaining of Roman citizens. And this right was confirmed again by the Lex Julia, which gave citizens in the province the right of appeal to Rome. There were circumstances in which a magistrate could so act against a citizen, but only after a proper trial. This was law. This was Roman law. And all citizens of Rome were protected by these laws. So the first time we see Paul making his appeal to his Roman citizenship is in Philippi. Paul appealed to his Roman citizenship in Philippi after authorities beat him and threw him in jail without a trial because a Roman citizen could not be condemned or punished without a fair hearing. That's why the Philippian magistrates were a little frightened We read about this in Acts 16, verse 35, and then 37 to 38.
At daybreak, the magistrates sent their police officers, saying, "Release those men." But Paul said to the police officers, "They had us beaten in public without a proper trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and they threw us into prison. And now they want to send us away secretly. Absolutely not. They themselves must come and escort us out." The police officers reported these words to the magistrates, and they were frightened when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens and came and apologized to them.
Paul makes a second appeal to his Roman citizenship in the city of Jerusalem. Paul appealed to his Roman citizenship in Jerusalem after he stirred up a Jewish crowd and was taken into custody by the Romans because a Roman citizen could not be scourged. That is why Paul escaped a lashing when he was in Jerusalem. We read about this in Acts chapter 22, verses 25 to 29.
When they had stretched him out for the lash, Paul said to the centurion standing by, "Is it legal for you to lash a Roman citizen without proper trial?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commanding officer and reported it, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the commanding officer came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" He replied, "Yes." The commanding officer answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money, but I was born a citizen," replied Paul. Then those who were about to interrogate him stayed away from him, and the commanding officer was frightened when he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had tied him up.
So we have his first appeal in Philippi. We have a second appeal when he's in Jerusalem. Paul makes a third appeal when he's in Caesarea. Paul appealed to his Roman citizenship in Caesarea before the Roman governor Festus, because a Roman citizen could appeal his case to Caesar. That is why Paul appealed to Caesar when Festus, the governor, the Roman governor residing in Caesarea, wanted to send him to Jerusalem and stand trial. We read about this in Acts 25, verses 6 to 7, and again 9 to 11.
After Festus had stayed not more than 8 or 10 days among them, that is in Jerusalem, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he sat on the judgment seat and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges that they were not able to prove. Paul said in his defense, "I have committed no offense against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and be tried before me on these charges?" Paul answered, "I am now standing before Caesar's judgment seat, where I should be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you yourself very well know. I appeal to Caesar."
So, in summary, we can say this about Paul's being born a citizen of Rome. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had civil rights that included, but not limited to, a fair trial before the implementation of physical punishment, as well as the right to appeal his case to Caesar if he disagreed with a lower court's ruling. Having looked at Paul's personal information, we want to shift attention to his professional information. What do we know about Paul professionally? Paul tells us several things about himself. First, he tells us that he's a trained rabbi. We read about this in Acts 22, verses 1 to 3.
"Brothers and fathers, listen to my defense that I now make to you." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became even quieter. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem. educated in strictness under Gamaliel according to the law of our ancestors, and was zealous for God.
Why does Paul speak in Aramaic if his native tongue was Greek? Well, Hebrew was the language of instruction in schools as well as the language of prayer and Torah. However, the religiously uneducated people who did not understand Hebrew were conversant only in Aramaic because that was the language learned while in exile in Babylon and spoken when the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel in 539 until the time of Alexander. Now, when Alexander the Great conquered Judah, the Greek language was used by many of the inhabitants because it became the commercial language of the land. Latin was also used to some extent in the land of Israel due to Rome's occupation of Judah. It tended to be used only by the Romans for matters of army administration. In fact, the sign above Jesus' cross was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So we have the people of Israel, the people in Jerusalem, basically are able to function in three languages. And we find this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find manuscripts that are written in Aramaic, manuscripts that are written in Greek, and manuscripts that are written in Hebrew. What rabbinic school did Paul attend while studying in Jerusalem? He tells us that he was educated in Jerusalem. Well, there were at least two rabbinic schools in Judea during the time of Paul, Shammai and Hillel. When Paul says he studied under Gamaliel, Paul identifies that he went to a rabbinic school. There were two rabbinic schools in Judea during this time, and Paul says that he studied under a school of Hillel. Now, the rabbinic school Shammai was known for a very strict and orthodox dogmatic teaching, emphasizing maximum requirements of the law. Whereas Hillel's rabbinic school was known for its flexibility, and that it was concerned about the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law. But who was Gamaliel? Who was this man that Paul studied under? Well, Gamaliel was a grandson of Hillel. So he comes from the family of Hillel. Gamaliel was a teacher of the law. He was also a member of the Sanhedrin. He tended to be more tolerant than other Pharisees and other members of the Sanhedrin, which was predominantly ruled by Sadducees. We read about Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, verses 34 to 39.
But a Pharisee, whose name was Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was respected by all people, stood up in the Sanhedrin council, ordered the men, that is the apostles, to be put aside for a short time. Then he said to the council, "Men of Israel, pay close attention to what you are about to do to these men. I say to you, stay away from these men and leave them alone, because if this plan or this undertaking originates with people, it will come to nothing. But if it originates with God, you will not be able to stop them, or you may even be found fighting against God."
Now, we need to pause and ask ourselves, what did Paul's training entail? What is it that he learned as he was educated in Jerusalem? Well, we can surmise that his training involved learning the Mosaic law. It also involved learning the legal customs and the practices added by the rabbis to the Old Testament practices, practices that tended to build a hedge around the law. Paul also learned how to interpret Scripture by way of quoting interpretations of famous rabbis. If we might look at a current commentary, let's just say if we were to look at a commentary on Philippians, and we wanted to examine what does it mean when it says that Jesus emptied himself. Many times you will read that commentary and it'll say, so-and-so hasn't understood it, this emptied himself to mean this. Whereas so-and-so believes it means that it means this. Or so-and-so says it means this before a conclusion that is drawn. That same type of thinking, that same type of learning what rabbis said is what Paul learned in rabbinic. He learned the interpretations of rabbis, just like today we learn interpretations of commentators and what they say concerning biblical difficulties that we might find in a verse. So he learned the interpretations of rabbis. He also learned Hillel's rules of interpreting Scripture. Rules on how do I understand Scripture? How do I govern my interpretation of Scripture? Just like we have rules today. He learned rules of interpretation. Paul also had a trade. He was a tent maker. We read about his tent making abilities in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and 3.
After this, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Paul approached them, and because he worked in the same trade, he stayed with them and worked with them, for they were tent makers by trade.
So if we were to summarize Paul and his description of himself as a trained rabbi, we might summarize it in this manner. So Paul was a trained rabbi who studied under a well-respected rabbi at a renowned rabbinic school in Jerusalem. The next thing we learn about Paul is that he was a devoted Pharisee. We read about his commitment to being a Pharisee in two different places. We read about it in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, and also Galatians chapter 1, verse 14.
I lived according to the law as a Pharisee. In my zeal for God, I persecuted the church. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers.
So who were the Pharisees? Well, historically, we could say that the term Pharisee means separate or detached. It's traditionally understood that the Pharisees are a splinter group of the Hasidim, a group of religious separatists who fought with Judas Maccabee. Now, if you remember Judas Maccabee, he was a man who took a stand against a Greek ruler named Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV was forbidding the Jews from practicing their religion. He destroyed the Torah. He forbade the act of circumcision. He slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple. These events led to Judas Maccabee to revolt against Antiochus IV and eventually establish religious freedom for the Jews. It's an act that's even commemorated today. Every December, the holiday of Hanukkah is a commemoration of when Judas Maccabee defeats Antiochus and restores religious freedom in Jerusalem. But there was a group of religious people that fought alongside Judas, and they were called the Hasidim. They were religious Jews that came alongside Judas Maccabee and fought with him. But once that battle was over, once that religious freedom had been established, that group of Hasidim split into two. One group became known as the Essenes. The other group became known as the Pharisees. And so the origins, it is suggested, of the Pharisees can be traced back to this single religious group that fought alongside Judas Maccabee, known as the Hasidim. Now, the first time we ever read about the Pharisees is found in Josephus. And Josephus refers to the Pharisees as a religious sect that stood against and gave John Hyrcanus a bit of a hard time in 134. Now, you may ask, who is John Hyrcanus? John Hyrcanus would have been the nephew or a nephew of Judas Maccabee. Judas's nephew, John Hyrcanus, establishes himself as a governor of Judea, and it's during that time that the Pharisees were named as being a religious sect that disagreed with John Hyrcanus at times. We also learn certain characteristics about the Pharisees. First, they cared. Pharisees were genuinely cared for the people of Judea. They also established covenantal loyalty. They observed strict laws of purity, Sabbath observance, prayer, tithing, as a form of identifying their loyalty to God. How does a Jew identify their loyalty to God? By the way in which they perform certain things for God, praying to God, observing the Sabbath. These were forms of covenantal loyalty to show their loyalty to God. Oral tradition. They honored both the written and oral laws handed down from their former teachers. And the message? Their message was one that focused on all people of Israel to become a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. As far as scribes, many Pharisees were scribes, but not all Pharisees were scribes. Theologically, well, concerning their worship, a person needed to be raised to divine heights in order to bring him or her to the spiritual transcendent God. And a lot of times it was done by way of practices, religious practices, to demonstrate their loyalty to this totally other transcendent God. Resurrection. Neither the body nor the soul perished after life, but God would resurrect all people, and all people will be rewarded or punished according to their deeds. The Pharisees had an elaborate doctrine of angelology and demonology. Free will. They believe that God controls events, though people also choose their own course of action. They recognize the tension between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. They also believed in a messianic kingdom. They believed in a cataclysmic messianic kingdom would come, but it was purely a political one. And it was a political one that was to be established by a human Messiah, by a coming Messiah. Next, we need to ask ourselves this question. Paul says that he was zealous for God. How zealous was Paul for Judaism? Well, we read about this in his own account in Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 to 6. And then we read about it in Acts 22, verse 3.
I lived according to the law as a Pharisee. In my zeal for God, I persecuted the church. According to the righteousness stipulated in the law, I was blameless. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, that is Jerusalem, educated in the strictness under Gamaliel according to the law of our ancestors, and I was zealous for God.
So Paul's zeal can be seen with regards to Stephen. Prior to the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7, a segment of Hellenistic Jews resisted and challenged Stephen's message, as well as slander and laid charges against Stephen before the Sanhedrin. And after Stephen responded to the high priest before the religious leaders in the crowd, Paul stood and gave his approval for Stephen's stoning. We read about this in Acts chapter 6, verses 8 through 7:1. And again, we read a little bit about this in Acts 7, verses 58, and then chapter 8, verse 1a.
Now Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. But some men from the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, as well as some from Cilicia and the province of Asia, stood up and argued with Stephen. Yet they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard this man speaking blasphemous words against Moses and God." They incited the people, the elders, and the experts in the law. Then they approached Stephen, seized him, and brought him before the council. They brought forward false witnesses who said, "This man does not stop saying things against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him saying that Jesus the Nazarene will destroy this place and change the customs that Moses handed down to us." All who were sitting in the council looked intently at Stephen and saw his face was like the face of an angel. And then the high priest said, "Are these things true?" And when they had driven him out of the city, they began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. And Saul agreed completely with killing him. Now on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were forced to scatter throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria.
So we see Paul giving his approval for the stoning of Stephen. Paul's zeal with regards to destroying the church in Judea is well known. He began to destroy the church throughout Judea. He went from house to house, dragging off men and women and put them in prison. Paul adds to Luke's account within his own testimony when he says that he went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who were followers of Jesus. We read about this in Acts chapter 8, verse 3, and again in chapter 22, verse 19.
But Paul was trying to destroy the church. Entering one house after another, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. I replied, "Lord, they," that is the Judean Jews, "themselves know that I was imprisoned and beat those in the very synagogues who believed in you."
So Paul's zeal was clearly evident in Judea, and that zeal was carried on to Damascus. Paul's zeal with regards to destroying the church wasn't enough in Judea. He wanted to destroy the church in Damascus as well. Paul is described as breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and he asked the high priest for letters to be taken to the synagogues in Damascus so that when he found Christians, the people of the way, he might take them as prisoners. We read about this in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2.
Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing out threats to murder the Lord's disciples, went to the high priest and requested letters from him to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if they found any who belonged to the way, either men or women, he could bring them as prisoners to Jerusalem.
So when we think about Paul and his professional information, we know that he was a devoted Pharisee. He tells us that he was a zealous Pharisee who made advancements within the ranks of the Pharisees rather quickly. So when we think about Paul's self-portrait, having looked at his personal information and having examined his professional information, we can say this about Paul. Paul was a Jew who grew up in an affluent religious home, who was raised in the Jewish tradition of his parents, who had a dual citizenship, who was educated in a renowned religious school, who became a teacher of religion, who joined a group of like-minded Jews, and who exhibited a great deal of zeal against those who followed Jesus.
Having concluded this lesson on Paul's self-portrait, we want to take a moment and ask, so what? We want to do a little bit of an application. What is so challenging about Paul's self-portrait? Well, Paul was a religious person. He grew up in a religious home. He had religious training, joined a religious group, and yet he did not know who Jesus was. In fact, he hated the followers of Jesus. He was so convinced that his religious perspective was right, that his doctrine was right, that his way of living should be followed, that he would destroy another person's reputation and perhaps even kill them. It was needed to be done to preserve his religious perspective. What is our personal story? How would we paint ourselves? What is our ancestral background? What is our training and occupation? How do we view ourselves? How do we treat others? Just something to think about. In the meantime, it is my hope that you will walk with the King and be a blessing to everyone you come in contact with. Thank you.